Okay, today on the Family Brand Podcast, I have Breck LeSueur, who is a podcast host of Bedtime History. Welcome, Breck, to the Family Brand Podcast.
Thanks, Melissa. Glad to be here.
So Breck and I, So Breck has this fun podcast. It's just what it says. It's called Bedtime History, and it's little nuggets of history, primarily geared towards an audience of children, I would say. And it's like little 10 to 15 minute episodes about things in history, which my kids really love. So, and then a little backstory. So Breck and I grew up basically on the same street. So Breck is a little bit older than me. I'm friends with his younger sister, Melanie. And I think, Breck, I remember when Melanie first told me, hey, my brother's doing a podcast. You should listen to it. And this was like a long time ago. I think you were probably the first person I knew that had a podcast. Like, how long have you been doing podcasts for?
Let's see. It's probably about 3 years now. 3 or 4 years.
Yeah.
I should probably figure that out for sure.
It doesn't.
A few years. Yeah, 4 maybe is a good guess.
Totally. And I just think it's such a great podcast. First of all, like I mentioned, my kids love it. And it's just like little stories of history. So I would just love to share this resource with our listeners, when you're on your trips this summer, road trips, whatever. It's been so fun for us to connect around, listen to these like little stories, and then it's just this great talking point. And I also love that it's like an education, informative, and it's just really fun. You do such a great job with little sound effects and keep it entertaining. So I just wanted to talk more about that today here with you. So tell me, what was your inspiration with starting the Bedtime History podcast?
Yeah, so I mean, bedtimes, all parents know, how fun bedtimes can be. They have their ups and downs, right? In some ways, that's my favorite time with kids. Often, just because if I've worked a long day and I haven't seen them, it is like quality one-on-one time. But it can also be stressful, if they're struggling to get down or fall asleep. Mine have all gone through different times.
And you have 4 children.
4, yeah.
Ages, you told me before we started recording.
Yeah,
almost 16 to 8, you said?
16, 14, 12, and 8. Yep.
Awesome.
Yeah. So yeah, at bedtime, we did a lot of different things. Sometimes I'd tell them stories, or often reading stories is another thing. But what I found is, we read together for a few minutes, and then sometimes it could take them an hour to go to bed, and reading for an hour would be a lot.
Yeah.
So we turned to audiobooks as one thing that they liked. And I knew about podcasts. I'd listened to some podcasts. And so I thought, maybe there's a podcast out there that's sort of like a criteria. There's a lot of good stuff they were listening to, but I thought, to me, the ideal podcast, at least for some evenings, would be like if they could learn something new, and if it could be learn something new, be inspirational, and relaxing. That was sort of this perfect formula for me.
Mm-hmm.
And I started to look around, and there's a ton of kids podcasts, but most of them were more kind of high energy and upbeat, and therefore during the day, and just really they're great, but they're just really off the wall. Sometimes even some I've heard potty humor, and I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
okay, this isn't really the vibe I'm going for. Maybe during the day that's fine, but we're trying to get them to wind down. And there are some good podcasts out there for that. A lot of them are like fairy tales and fictional stories, which are great. But I already loved history myself. It's I took a lot of history classes in college, and I was just something I did on my own, a lot of reading and studying. I was just been very curious about history. So I thought, what if I could, I'll create this simple story for them, record it myself, write a little script, record it, add some sound effects, and play it for them, see what they think. And then podcasts are so easy that I could just put it up and see what happens. And so the first episode I created was Neil Armstrong, just a basic story of kind of Neil Armstrong's childhood, some of his education and training, and then his trip to the moon. It was pretty simple, like 8 minutes. Very like crude in terms of like recording quality, and I didn't have any kind of narration voice at the time. So I listened back and I'm like, I'm so monotone and the quality is bad, is poor. But I went ahead and put it up because it's free and easy.
You
And
started anyway, yeah.
yeah, I did. And that's kind of been my philosophy with a lot of things. Like just do something and get it out there, see what sticks, and then iterate, as you go. So they had fun with it. They kind of helped me do some of the sound effects, and I put it up. And I wish I knew like how many listens I got in the first month. Um, the first thing I did notice is there weren't a lot of like history podcasts for kids. There were a couple of them, not many. And I don't think I had a ton of listens. I mean, it could have been like 100, and that would have probably been enough for me to think, oh, like 100 people heard
Yeah.
this. Like, wow, okay, that's not thousands or anything, but there's 100. Maybe they'd like to hear another one. And then I think at first I was doing like 2 a month, and just thought I would see how it went, and they got a little better each time. I don't really remember what the trajectory really was from there, except that I just noticed I was getting more and more listeners each month. And I think within probably 3 or 6 months, I was like, oh, this is something that really could go somewhere, and I'm gonna keep, spending time with it and hope it might take off. And so, you know how a podcast goes. It's like you start with an idea and then you just kind of iterate on it and improve a little as you go. And, rest is kind of history from there. But that's kind of the initial idea and kind of how it started.
That's awesome. And I know you probably fall under the kids and family charts as far as charts for podcasts go. And I see you at like in the top, like your podcast does really well. Like people are listening to it and loving it. So I think that's so cool.
Yeah. It's fun to see how it's taken off. Another thought.
What would you say is the primary age or target audience for your podcast?
That's a great question. I when I initially created it, the idea was to make it like kind of to the lowest denominator, which was maybe like a 6-year-old even. I thought, if I can do something that's simple enough for a 6-year-old, then it could be enjoyed by kids all through elementary. Probably now, I would say probably anywhere from like 8 to 10-year-olds, could understand it. But then we have kids up through junior high and high school, and we actually have quite a few adults that listen to it too. So that's kind of fun. I think especially someone who maybe is new to history or just wants like a survey of a lot of different topics, that's worked well for them. And I think partly too, I don't know if you've listened to many audio, like nonfiction audiobooks, but I have trouble like following them, when they start to get into a lot of details, and it's easy to get distracted. With these, I think because they're written for young kids, it's, the language is simpler. They're just easier, like for anyone to follow. There's one appeal, I think, for adults, but and that's probably one of the biggest challenges, at least when I have a couple script writers, there's a few that have come in and out, is being able to like simplify complex topics for kids. You can't just be talking about the Cold War. You can't just say, oh, during the Cold War. It's like, well, you got to explain the Cold War.
What is the Cold War? Yeah.
Like, what is, and then you get to what's the Soviet Union, and there's all this.
Yes.
You're really trying to find ways to simplify it for kids. And for me, that's actually kind of the fun part is how can I take something complex and really simplify it to where kids can understand it and process it, and then use like words that, that would be in their vocabulary. So.
And I like how at the end of your episodes, for the most part, I feel like you kind of tie this bow on it and have them think like, I can't think of a good example, but you know what I'm talking about. Tell me, like, what's your intention like at the end of your episodes?
Yeah, so that was part of it too. So they're learning something new, and then they're not always, I'd say, inspirational. I do always try to end with some kind of moral. Here's something we can learn from it, or from what was done. So with biographies, it's obviously easier. and just, I think the line early on I used, like Neil Armstrong, you can learn, you can have determination and go to school and learn good things. So then you can, accomplish these other things. And so yeah, I usually try to conclude with some kind of takeaway or how they might apply something from that person's life to their own.
I almost had my 15-year-old, he's homeschooling right now. And I told him like, hey, do you want to come do this podcast episode with me just now with you and I? And I almost had him, but so we were talking about it and he's like, so this is his question to you.
Oh, good.
He's like, where do you find your inspiration for the topics that you present on the podcast?
Yeah, that's a great question too. So when I've worked with script writers, some of them have come through like listening with their kids. Like, hey, I love your podcast and I write some, can I help out in any way? What I tend to do is let them pick topics that interest them. I usually have a list going from kids that have requested different topics. So we're usually working from that, or I think it's always nice if the person writing it, they already have some kind of interest in it. So one of my writers right now, she loves everything like royalty and related to like England. She's been there many times. And so a lot of we just did one about Big Ben, the clock tower. And she's done scripts about some of the different royalty there. So that for her is something easy to write about. And then the same for me, like I know you asked about favorite episodes. Like when we've gone somewhere new or interesting, I'll often do an episode about that place. We went to Costa Rica a couple of years ago, and it kind of ties in with other things that are going on in my life. And then that way, when I show up at the place, it's more interesting because I know some of the story behind it. And so I kind of, because I'm doing this on the side, it's nice to be able to, something I'm already interested in, to be able to research it and then talk about it. So that's often the way I get inspiration. I try to bring in like a diversity of backgrounds. So there's a lot of like women's history also, and like Black history. And I just because we have listeners, lots of different listeners, and even all over the world. And so just bringing in a lot of different influences is something we try to do. So we're always kind of like looking at what we're interested in ourselves, but then also trying to kind of branch out at the same time. So.
Yeah. What would you say? Because I think it's important for kids to know history. What would you say, or have there been any outcomes that you could think of for families that have listened to your podcast, like knowing history? Are there any stories about, I don't know if I'm asking this very well, just stories families have shared with you, how your podcast has changed or blessed their life?
Oh, that's a good question. Honestly, most of the feedback I get is related to bedtime, and a lot of kids experience anxiety at bedtime. Like I get so many comments. It just kind of makes, it's tough to just hear how much of that's going on. And I don't know exactly what it's related to. You can imagine all the different things. So a lot of the feedback is just like, thanks for, being able to share a story at bedtime that's relaxing. That was actually, so the other kind of component is I always try to make it very calming, which isn't always easy with history. Because history is, so I have to be careful how I tell some of these stories, to filter some things for kids. So that's not so much immoral, just as how it's helped them. I'm trying to think of any specific outcomes, related to history. People always love it when it's about somewhere that they're from, so they'll write in and mention that.
No, but I think that's amazing. Like if you can have support families and having wins in their homes, like whether that's a bedtime or calming, like anxiety, like I think that's huge.
Yeah. Thanks.
So you, just a couple of your episodes, I know you talk about people there's places, there's world events. I've seen a few that you've done that were kind of current events that you would talk about, obviously world history type events. Does that basically cover most of what is in the podcast?
Yeah, it covers most of them. Yeah, it can really be about anything. I also just love learning about science too, and so I've thrown some of those in. But then I always have to tie it in. I'm like, the history of stars. They have a history too, I guess. It typically falls under science,
Yeah.
like we've done one about bees and beekeeping, and so I had someone ask me once, they're like, are you worried you're gonna run out of topics? And I was like, shit, are you serious? So many things, don't
Yeah.
even scratch the surface. But yeah, so it could be about anything really. It's probably just me being curious and wanting to find ways to pull it into the podcast at times. But yeah.
Do you have a favorite episode that stands out above all others for you?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's hard to pick one. Some of the ones about places I've been to, I mean, and you lived in Hawaii, so we have one about Hawaii that was really interesting that I loved researching. You just realize, I think we grew up kind of with a more of a Western civilization history, that we learn. I think my kids have been bringing home more stuff about other parts of the world that I've been impressed with. I feel like mine was
Yeah.
mostly kind of Western or, maybe some of the Middle Eastern stuff. But so just hearing about Hawaii and like all the different tribes and the wars and these kings and like there's this whole epic, history just in Hawaii that kind of blew my mind. And then you visit there and you think of all these events happening. That was a cool one. I did one about Jacques Cousteau around the time I was getting like a diving certification. So just that was cool. I did one about George Lucas. I just love Star Wars. So
Yeah. So why not?
yeah, the handful of the ones that come to mind. We did the last one we did was this Monday. This is from one of the writers. It was about a coyote that's taken in as like a pup, becomes this guy's pet, and ends up flying with him. He takes the coyote pup or pet with him over to England to fly during World War II, and it like comes along with him on his flight. So it's the name of the coyote was Jeep, so it's Jeep the Flying Coyote. That was one of the more kind of exotic episodes, but I loved it. It was written really well. So I'm fortunate to have like great people who have helped out with the podcast.
Let's go. We'll have to listen to that one. I've never heard about Jeep the Flying Coyote.
I didn't either. Yeah, I started to think maybe we need to do a book about all these different animals. We did another one about this cat that ended up on these different battleships during World War One, like a whole animal history, where animals show up in history would be fun. But
yeah, that's a good idea.
Yeah.
Well, okay, one last thing I want to touch on is you did an episode. This is something we like talking about it with Family Brand, is knowing like the power of family history and family stories. And I know you did an episode about your grandma early on too. Yeah. What had you kind of decide that you wanted to do an episode about her?
Yeah. I don't remember how it came about exactly. I don't know if it was my mom's idea. She kind of helped me write the script. Or I also had this thought that it's just a reminder that I need to kind of incorporate this more in the podcast, but often you have these stories about people who, make the history books and do something that changes history. But there's this whole other part of history, mostly, like family histories, where it's these people who are just kind of going about their day-to-day lives, like just loving their kids and taking care of their kids. And we know how much work that can be, right? But history is influenced in these like small things that families are doing, which with your podcast and business is helping families do that. And often too, it's like we can look back on history and it's easy to see all the negative events and things. Those tend to make the books, the big wars and shocking, events and things. But then I try to remember, like, think about families, in their own little like taking care of each other and mothers and fathers loving their kids. And I try to remind myself that whenever I kind of get negative about history, because like
Mhm.
no one's writing books about that. That's not making the history books. So back to my grandma, I thought, I need to have an episode about someone who is like leading a life where they're helping and taking care of those around them, and they're changing the world in like their way, in their smaller circle. Because that, most of the kids who are listening, they're not necessarily going to be doing things that would make the history books, right? And that's not even what really matters. And that's always been a value to me, is like, how can I make a difference in my little sphere?
Mhm.
And so with her, it was like a story, and I think we did it for her birthday. It's kind of how it came about. I was like, I just want to tell a story about someone who has done good things in their little part of the world. She was like a piano teacher too, which is cool. So she influenced a lot of people that way. I think everyone, yeah. And in her case, it's like she had influenced others in that way, but also just a good mother and grandmother. And that's for kids, like they don't have to be, you know,
On a world
these grand
stage.
figures, right, on
Yeah.
a world stage. Because really, that to me it's those kind of small relationships and things that can change the world. So
That's really beautiful.
yeah.
Well, thank you for this. And again, anyone listening, please go check out Bedtime History. Again, we've loved it. It's been perfect. Like have little talking points that we can share together. And I was flipping through your episodes. We're going to Europe this summer for the first time. And I was noticing, oh, you have like an episode about the Leaning Tower of Pisa. And I don't even know. I'm sure you have even more than that. I'll have to check it out. And I mean, it would be perfect, like for my little ones to listen to. So not like you're saying, having to dive into like the deep history of a region and stuff like that. It's like bite
Yeah,
and easy to consume.
something simple. Yeah, so I also have the YouTube channel. So there's the podcast, the YouTube channel. Take a lot of the audio and turn it into like video slideshows. So
Oh, cool.
it's sometimes helpful with kids. And then there's also the website, bedtimehistorystories.com. You can search that for all the text, for all the scripts, and too, if you're looking for, I think it's all categorized there. That's the thing you don't get sometimes with podcasts. I don't
Yeah.
know if there's a way to categorize them, but on the website you can go and there's like a whole Europe section.
Oh, cool. Awesome. Any final words of wisdom or advice to anyone listening today?
I think of anything else. Just yeah, keep learning and being curious, and teaching your kids, and it can help inspire them and give them a perspective about the world they might not otherwise have. And so yeah, keep doing the good things you're doing.
Awesome. Thanks, Breck.
Yeah, thanks, Melissa. See ya.
Bye.